So good morning, everybody. My name is Sharon Rich. I am the Senior Trust Advisor with AGED. It stands for Advocates and Guardians for the Elderly and Disabled. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you that are not real familiar with AGED, just a brief on what we do is to manage special needs trust for seniors and persons with disabilities. The point in using a special needs trust is to qualify for Medicaid when you have too much money, whether it's too much income every month or you're over the asset limit. So we like to be a resource to the community. We work with a lot of guardians, family members, attorneys, and social workers, etc., throughout the state of Florida. So again, thank you for joining us today, and feel free to give us a call anytime if you want to talk through anything. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few little housekeeping things. We would ask you to put your questions into chat today. We are going to leave plenty of time at the end to answer your questions, and we encourage you to ask questions, please. The certificate of attendance will be emailed to everybody after the presentation, probably within a week or so. And that will also include a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. And we also are recording this today, and the recording will be posted to our website. So lots of materials there for you to follow up with. And if you're a guardian, of course, attorney, a waiver support coordinator, we have continuing ed credits for you also. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are very pleased to have Claudia Porpiglia with us as our guest speaker, and she is going to be talking about the Agency for Persons with Disabilities, otherwise known as APD. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Claudia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Claudia, as she said. I'm a care manager, a benefits consultant, and a professional guardian. But my expertise with APD goes back to about 35 years ago when my own daughter got enrolled with DCF's developmental disabilities, and we started the journey. And through that.
Sorry, Claudia, please, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, see how that goes. Anyway. So I'm a professional care manager, a benefits consultant, professional guardian, and I'm a mother of a 37-and-a-half-year-old developmentally disabled child who still lives in my home with full care. My experience with, first of all, DCF and developmental disabilities, then Agency for Persons with Disabilities, spans about 35 years. We have been through every change, every change. And the changes that are coming, I'm very aware of, but I also now work with families that have developmentally disabled children and try to help them navigate the complexities. The presentation today is going to go really fast because there's a lot to cover. And so I just encourage you that don't get intimidated by that. And some of the things in the PowerPoint that you see have changed in the last year or so and haven't been updated, but I'll kind of update you as we go along. And there'll be time for questions. And then you can also contact me by email if you have questions. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the agency's mission. Now, the mission has changed a number of times over the years. When APD first started, the mission included quality of life. That was removed a number of years ago, as you can see, and then they started talking about the partnership with local communities, private providers who assist, families, etc. The new statement is much shorter, and it's significant with what's happening with funding and the situation in the state of Florida. So the new mission statement is the agency supports persons with developmental disabilities in living, learning, and working in their communities. But here are the goals. Increase access to community-based services, treatment, and residential options, increase the number of individuals with developmental disabilities in the workforce, and improve management of the agency and oversight of providers. As a parent and a professional, what I see with that is they're really trying to find more natural resources and provide less funding. It's just a fact. Funding is stretched to the max. That doesn't, but I don't want to discourage you from applying. I just want you to understand that this was a move that happened. I think Sharon and I attended a hearing by phone about 3 years ago on the way to the guardianship conference, where there was a move to go to managed care. And when it went to that move for managed care, the agency started scrambling because managed care was not the way to go, but they had to get in budget, and they weren't in budget. All right, so let's talk about who's served through the agency for persons with disabilities. Autism, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, Phelan-McDermott syndrome, and then there's sometimes funding for children ages 3 to 5 that are high risk of a developmental disability. That funding usually kicks in during the summertime when they're not in school, but there is some funding. And we'll talk a little more about those disabilities and what really qualifies for those disabilities later on in this presentation. APD is divided into regions. And here's a map of the regions. You can go to their website and find out what region you're in. Within the regions, there are individual offices that are closer to you. You rarely have to go to the offices. Almost everything is done electronically, and actually they discourage you from showing up at their office. When you show up, you often have trouble seeing someone, but this kind of gives you a picture of how they've divided in the state. For our region, the central region, and I know this webinar is actually for more, but our field office is Orlando, Wildwood, and Lakeland. So let's talk a little bit about the services that APD funds. Okay, so you have funding, which is through the Med Waiver program, and the funding is a combination of federal and state dollars. But the state has to then present a plan to the federal government that is approved in how they spend money. The categories that money can be spent on at this time is life skills development. So life skills development is things like companion services for someone to go out into the community for socialization, supported employment, and adult day training. Adult day training is what we used to refer to as workshop. Unfortunately, because of COVID, adult day training has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. Before COVID, many of the adult day training centers had contracts with businesses, and the individuals who went to adult day training actually had the opportunity to perform tasks. An example is Quest here in Orlando. Their Apopka workshop had a contract with somebody that made cornhole games. So they would actually measure the beans in the bags and prepare the bags, and then one of the staff would sew it. Today, there are very few of the workshops that have contracts. Some of the workshops have tried to find some things to do. I know Quest does some preparation of soap. They grow some herbs in that, but it's been greatly reduced. So the adult day training now is pretty much working on computer skills sometimes, learning daily living skills. And for those that can't do it, as a parent, I have to say it's kind of more just someplace for them to be and be cared for safely, so that for 6 hours a day, there's somewhere for them to be, and they're around other people. The second group is supplies and equipment. So this applies mostly to people 21 and over, which is the majority of who serve through APD, although sometimes people younger are. Consumable medical supplies, pull-ups, diapers, wipes, durable medical equipment. So if an individual needs a wheelchair and they're not able to get it through their insurance, whether it's private insurance or Medicaid, sometimes it can be gotten with Med Waiver funds. It's all a moving target depending on where funds are available. Environmental accessibility adaptations. We were fortunate enough 20 years ago that the state paid to have a bathroom made handicap accessible. So they redid the bathroom so that it was a roll-in shower, et cetera. It is very hard to get. It takes a lot of work on the part of the waiver support coordinator who helps the family, but it can happen. And then personal emergency response systems. This tends to be for those who are living in supported living or who are able to live independently, but maybe they have some physical things that limit their ability to contact someone, so they can get a medical alert system through the agency. Group 3 is personal supports. Personal supports are the hands-on supports. So personal supports are things like personal care, bathing, feeding, dressing, keeping someone safe in their home, providing support in that way. There are some funds for respite. It's very limited, but respite is pretty much for those under the age of 21. Occasionally someone on the wait list, which we'll talk about in a little bit, can get some respite care if there's a health emergency in the family or some crisis where they need some kind of break. Group 4 is residential services, and it's divided into residential habitation, which is a fancy word for group homes, specialized medical home care. So this is a very specialized, a group home possibly that has a higher level of care, has more nursing, and then supported living coaching. Now, I'm going to make a comment here just as an aside. Some of you may have heard of medical group homes such as Fern Park or Laurel Hills or Howell Branch Court. They actually are not funded through the Agency for Persons with Disabilities. They are actually a part of nursing home or ICP funding, because it then goes to a level, but they are more like a group home in how they are laid out and in the things they do. And the individuals can participate in workshop or some kind of day program. So I'm not going to get into detail, but I didn't even realize that difference until I was several years into doing this professionally, and I had a family and I realized the funding is different. Group 5 is support coordination. Anyone who receives funding on a regular basis through APD has a waiver support coordinator. That individual is technically a contractor with the state, but they are required to do all the trainings and follow all the rules of APD. In the old days, before they had waiver support coordination, they were social workers who worked for the state. Today, they're independent contractors. About 2 years ago, the agency, they weren't able to go manage care, but they did push for waiver support coordinators now have to be a part of a company of at least 4 individuals. They cannot be independent totally. There's lots of reasons for why they did that. I'm not going to get into that. All I'm going to say is the day of having an independent person who really is going to fight for you in a different way is a lot harder today than it's been. That doesn't mean we don't have good waiver support coordinators. And if there's a waiver support coordinator on here, I love waiver support coordinators, but it did change the landscape. Then we go to group 6. Group 6 is all things that are specialized, and these funds are restricted funds. So the funds before this are all funds that are allotted to an individual, but they can kind of use the funds in any of those categories. So to give you an example, if somebody gets money for personal supports, but they want to use some of it for durable medical equipment, durable medical supplies, they can. Or if they get durable medical supplies like diapers, but they want to buy them themselves and use the $100 and some towards care, they can. Group 6 is restricted because these are all very specialized services and are things that have been deemed the individual absolutely needs. So it's private duty nursing, residential nursing, skilled nursing, dietitian services, respiratory therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and mental health counseling, behavioral services. So when somebody gets funds in these categories, that funding has to be used for these services, okay? The rest of the funding has some flexibility. And then group 7 is transportation. This is things like somebody's going to a workshop, whether it's their group home providing transportation or an outside transportation service. they can get extra funding to help them get back and forth. I will tell you, this has become a category that's very difficult because the agency does not provide a lot of money towards this. And we all know that the cost of driving a vehicle has gone up dramatically in the last couple of years. So, you know, it's hard to find transportation. I always tell people, if you're moving someone to a group home and you need transportation to a workshop, first question out of your mouth is, do you transport? And which workshops do you transport to? Because finding transportation can be very difficult. Same thing if they're at home and they need transportation. And in general, you're not going to get enough to cover access links at $4 each way from the agency. And then the 8th category is dental services. This is a little rarer in these days. Once Medicaid went to the once Medicaid kind of honed down the providers for their dental, it's rare you get this, but sometimes when someone has a dental need that goes above what Medicaid will cover, the waiver support coordinator could request additional funding and it can be paid to a dentist. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what is eligibility for the agency. And I put this stop sign here ASAP because most people that know anything about the agency know that they have a wait list. The wait list is somewhere between 26 and 30,000 people right now. The state of Florida is the retirement state, as we all know. And we have a large amount of developmentally disabled. And I can tell you right now, there are many more than are on the wait list that are out there with no services. But if you're not on the wait list, if you haven't gotten eligibility and you haven't put yourself on that list that says you are eligible, then what happens when you need services? When there's a crisis, when a family member dies, when a family member has some kind of health crisis that can no longer care, or behaviors escalate and they can no longer be handled. So I am a real proponent, whether you're a family member, whether you're a guardian, no matter what your role is, if you have an individual who might be eligible for this agency, you do an application. The application is not that time consuming, and all you have to lose is a couple hours of time. But if you're not on that list, you're never going to have services. And if you get in a crisis and you have to do the application and try to get services, just getting crisis when you're on the wait list. We had a case, some individuals had aged trust that we were assisting. It was almost 8 months and they were on the wait list, and it took almost 8 months to get them into a group home when they needed housing. And they were in an inappropriate setting for 8 months while this went on. So what's the process? Process is fairly simple. You do an application. The key to the application is to use APD's terminology, and it's all on their website. So all of those services that we just talked about, use the terms. If you think they're going to need residential habitation, they're going to need somewhere to live, you put that on the list, even if you're not sure. If you think that they might be residential habitation or they might be supported living, which is 2 different things, and we'll talk a little more about the supported living down the road here if we have time. You list both of them. You list personal supports. You list life skills, because they might need supported employment or they might need a day program. The key is you list everything on the application, but you use APD's wording. Okay, you list support coordination, even though it's automatic. I tell people, just put it on there anywhere when they ask about services. Make sure you include all diagnoses that apply. Now, I'm going to get more into this as we talk about eligibility, but if you have intellectual disability, which is an IQ of below 70, and you have a diagnosis of autism, make the primary diagnosis intellectual disability. I'm going to explain a little more about that in a few minutes, but I'm telling you, do not use autism as a primary diagnosis unless you have to. They have changed, the rules haven't changed, but they've changed how they are exercising the rules, and getting an approval under autism has become extremely difficult. So intellectual disability is a little more cut and dry, not totally. Cerebral palsy is a little more cut and dry. Down syndrome. But autism is kind of not a great category to have to use if you have to use it. Definitely, if someone has been autism spectrum disorder and Asperger's, use the autism spectrum disorder. Asperger's has kind of been changed in how they look at it. It's been changed in the diagnosis code, and it automatically puts the chances of an approval down considerably. List any and all services. I was just talking about that. You use their terminology and list anything, even if you don't know what they're going to need. If you're applying when they're 2 or 3 years old, you have no idea what they're going to need. But we put it all down. It's not that that drives the train, but I feel like as things change in the agency, it's a safety net. And then if they ask about, and the application has some questions, if they're asking about physicians and contacts, make sure you include it. Anyone who is aware of their diagnoses. All right, so that's for the application itself. Documentation, you need a copy of the Social Security card, copy of the birth certificate, proof of Florida residency. It can be their ID or a parent's ID, a parent's utility bill. If they are not old enough to have an ID, you use the parent's information. And then if they're on Medicaid, you include the Medicaid card. If they're on Medicare, you include that. If they have letters of guardianship or guardian advocacy, or if there's a durable power of attorney or healthcare surrogate, you include those. And then you're going to include proof of disability. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But they're not going to ask for that. If you do not submit it, they'll send you an email asking for it. And if you don't send it, they'll just deny the application and you'll have to start all over. So let's talk about what proof is. So intellectual disability, they like to have 3 reports that show an IQ below 70, below 70. This usually, depending on the age of the child, if they're younger, you may not have that. You may only have a doctor's exam. It may be that you wait till they come in school and get their first psychological to apply. And you may only have one, but and I tell people, go ahead and apply with one, because they know if they're younger, that may be all that they have. It's worth the time. And then the agency may ask for something more. But they give very specifics on what they're looking for. In general, the school districts the majority of the school districts used to do some kind of educational psych every 3 years for someone who had an IEP for intellectual disability, autism, those kind of things. I am finding more and more individuals who are coming to me and they're in their 20s and these psychological evals were not done. I have one particular county I'm not going to name. I had an individual who was autism who never had a psychological eval through his whole school time. So we had nothing. He also had high anxiety. His mother was called to the school about every 6 weeks to calm him down, and none of that was documented. So another little thing, if you're an individual that either has a child or you're working with a family with a younger child, you're a financial advisor, you're an attorney, you're a social worker, have them ask about these things and make sure these are done, and then make sure they get copies and keep them. The other issue with proofs is if you have an older individual, if you're a guardian who suddenly got someone who's 40 years old and you don't have access to these records, most of these records are destroyed within 5 years of someone aging out of school or graduating. The only thing that's left is the transcript. Once in a long while, the transcript has some kind of notation on it, but it's rare. And I actually had one case where the girl was 49 years old and one of the schools in Orange County had 2 pieces of paper that had not been destroyed that proved her disability. But that's rare. Autism. This is the one I'm going to spend a little time on because this is the one that's become difficult. So if you go to APD's site and you look for the law definitions of these, autism talks about an autism spectrum diagnosis, and then it gives a list of things that one list behaviors, and there's 3 categories, and they're supposed to have 2 of 3. The behaviors are the way they word it is very general. Okay, it's very general. And up until about 2 years ago, I mean, social awkwardness, inappropriate comments, etc., was qualifying someone under the autism diagnosis. Today, they are emphasizing severe behaviors. And I've had the experience of 2 hearings where I have point blank asked the psychologist and APD what a severe behavior is, and I have not gotten a definition. So this is why I say autism is I don't tell people not to apply, but autism is much harder to get an eligibility for, because autism, we've done great on interventions. The behaviors that we saw 30 years ago in autistic individuals are much rarer today. I always tease with my clients, families, they can walk, talk, chew gum, and talk sports, but put them in a job place, put them in certain situations, they struggle. By the definition, the legal definition that has been designed with med waiver, those individuals in general do not become eligible for services with APD. And that's sad, because one of the services that they could benefit from is supported living. And again, when we get closer to the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's an important thing to be educated on in this environment we're in with funding. All right, so then we have Down syndrome. So Down syndrome, they want a chromosome report or genetic testing before the age of 18. And then they also want a doctor's diagnosis on office stationary along with medical records. I actually had a family that came to me several years ago. They had taken in the man's brother had lived in Canada his whole life. Obviously Down syndrome, no doubt about it. They applied for eligibility, and of course they had no records, because in Canada they didn't need the records. The family had gotten rid of them. The parents were now gone, and they had no records. And even though a doctor said he's obviously Down syndrome, they were denied eligibility. So they called me up and said, what can we do? Should we spend the money on chromosome report? So, I'm a little bit of a rebel. Anybody that knows me knows I don't like the word no, and I don't like people having to spend money for things that they don't need. So I told them, I said, before you go get a chromosome test, ask them if, with a picture of him, that it's Down syndrome, that could happen after the age of 18. So they sent in an email and they got eligibility without doing chromosome testing. Sometimes the ivory tower doesn't recognize their own ignorance, and it worked. Otherwise, they would have spent the money. But this is just one of the things that we've dealt with as funds have become tighter and tighter. The next categories I just kind of grouped together because they all have the same thing. They need medical records before the age of 18. And you'll send them in. Sometimes they'll ask for more. If ever you do an eligibility and they're asking for more and you can't figure out what they're asking for, ask for a phone call. These individuals that we deal with in the offices want to help you. I will tell you, they are awesome to work with. I have not found them to be hard. They are in between a rock and a hard place because they have rules that they have to follow. So often when you talk with them, they will help you figure out what you need to get over that hump. So don't be afraid to ask for a phone call. Don't be afraid to say, I don't understand what you're asking for. I will make one other comment. Phelan-McDermott syndrome was added just a few years ago. It's a very unique genetic disorder. And that is one of them that they have offered funding before the age of 18 for some support, just so that families will not give up because of some of the behaviors in that. So sometimes you can get funding before the age of 18. It just depends. But in general, it's 18 to 21 is when funding will start. It just depends on the disability and the situation. And then high risk for developmental disabilities. This is the one, it's not real common. It's not as common as it was when my daughter was growing up, but they'll give some therapies. They might give some money towards incontinence supplies. They might give some behavioral services to help with behaviors. They really expect the school system to provide most of this from 3 on. But you know, again, if you can get eligible, or lots of times you can't get eligible at that age, but you think you need services, contact the agency and see what they can do for you. It never hurts to make a phone call. So the next elephant in the room is, what do you do when you don't have proof of a disability before the age of 18? I've already used the example of Down syndrome. This is really difficult, especially with intellectual disability. So what I find is, if you have an individual who's in their 50s or 60s, they've lived at home with their family, and you know that their IQ is below 70, often considerably below 70. The problem is IQ is a combination score of intellectual and functional. So the difficulty is, if you ask APD to go ahead and do an IQ score, the chances that the IQ score is going to be skewed and possibly be above 70, even though intellectually they are definitely below 70, is very high. Had an individual who was in his late 60s, was living with his brother and sister-in-law, his sister and brother-in-law. He wanted to be in a group home and he wanted to go to a workshop. He was bored stiff. We could not get him because functionally, he was pretty good because the family had socialized him. They had required things of him. So, you can ask for them to do an IQ, but I always want to prepare people that the IQ is this combination score, and it becomes very difficult. I'm also seeing this with a lot of the higher functioning autistic who had an IQ score that was maybe, when they were in school, in the low 60s. If they have an IQ score after they get out of school, often their IQ is right in that 70, 71, 72 range, not because of their intellect, but because they are socially able to answer questions in a way that skews the score. And they're able to do some things that are on the functional side that skew the score. The other thing they ask for, in addition to them doing an IQ score, is they ask for a summary of how the individual's disability has affected their life. This is the part, to me, that is extremely, extremely important when it comes to trying to get eligibility. Helping someone understand the lack of safety that they have, their lack of awareness, their vulnerability, their lack of being able to safely prepare food for themselves, just anything that illustrates their need for support. And I tell people, it's not a slam dunk, but again, if you have a situation where you need someone to have some level of care, and you feel that what APD could provide through their residential or their support system, then do it. Try. I always tell people, I've got a woman who lived with family till she was 69 years old. She's a combination of autism and a traumatic brain injury. Somehow her family got her on the APD wait list when she was in her late 50s. Brother happened to work for the VA, and he did about a 40-page document that got her eligible. You would think because of her age, when she needed to move out of her family home, that an assisted living would have been an appropriate placement. Well, first of all, she doesn't have the funds for assisted living. Dad didn't Dad didn't apply for Social Security till she was well beyond the age of 22, so she only gets SSI. But she also would not fit in the assisted living community. She's intelligent in one way, but then she has quirky behaviors, quirky things that she says and does that would not work well in the assisted living community. I've had developmentally disabled individuals live in assisted living communities. I had one that was successful, but that was because the staff in that particular community took this gentleman, Down syndrome gentleman, under their wings, and they made him successful. But that hasn't been what I've seen across the board. So there are reasons in certain situations to try to fight this eligibility battle, even if you don't have the proof before the age of 18. But I won't lie, it's an uphill battle. And it sometimes takes, I've had people go to congressmen, senators, etc. I've had the governor's office, and you know what? If that's what it takes, to give that individual what they need, then I'm okay with that. How long does a decision take? Well, in the old days, I would say it's a couple months if everything goes in perfect. Supposedly a determination is supposed to be within 90 days, but the Agency for Persons with Disability, not only have they had budget cuts, but during COVID, they lost a lot of their seasoned people because, like many of the other agencies out there, the people who could have been retired and were working because they really loved the environment and they loved the people they worked with, when they got dictated to work at home, decided it was time to retire. So there are a lot more, I don't want to say green people, but people doing jobs that they weren't used to doing. So, it's supposed to be within 90 days, but it sometimes takes longer. If the goal is eligibility, I don't have a problem with it being longer. You usually get an email confirmation and you know who's handling your case. So when you feel like it's going too long, shoot an email to them. Don't call them. I will tell you, calling unless you just aren't getting any response is not a good idea. They're swamped. But send an email, you'll get a response 95% of the time. Sometimes it's that whatever you send in, they want something else and they thought an email went out or you missed an email. But take the time to follow up. If you get denied, you do have the option to appeal. An appeal involves an administrative hearing, and I don't have a slide on this, but I do want to talk about this a little bit. And it's done by an administrative judge. I have now been through about 8 of these hearings. And I tell people, if it's really important, do it. Don't wait and then reapply years later. This is about preparing for the future. And this is about making sure that people have the support they need to be able to live. And, you don't have to have an attorney. There are attorneys out there. I sometimes help people with hearings, but a lot of it is you being able to plead your case and have that other individual there, that administrative judge who can hear, and providing more information. Sometimes I have families go get another evaluation. I've done that several times. I've had them go to a psychologist and get a more detailed evaluation that doesn't just look at the IQ or the autism or the cerebral palsy, but looks at the practical side. I have one particular psychologist that did an 8-page document. 3.5 of the pages was all the things this individual couldn't do. This was my individual in Volusia County that didn't have a single educational psych, no documentation of his anxiety and behaviors. And he was able to get eligibility. So again, it's a call that you make, but you can ask for that administrative hearing, and they will do it. So let's talk now about what happens after you get eligibility. The individual goes on a wait list. The wait list, as I said, is somewhere around 26,000 plus long. Don't let that intimidate you. Please don't let that intimidate you, because, the reality is we're on lists all over in life. And if you're not on a list, you don't get something. We go on lists, wait lists for other things. This is an important thing. When the individual is made eligible, they're put into rating categories. And again, this is available on APD's website if you want more information, but there's 7 categories. Typically, unless there's an immediate need, they're put in category 7. I'll just tell you, category 7. People call it the deep hole. They call it lots of things. I don't call it that. What it means is this individual is eligible, but right now they have the supports they need to survive. That's what it means. But being there is important. One of the reasons I tell people it's important is we've had for a number of years now, there's been grant money that every year at the end of the year has come available for individuals who are aging out of school. And they're looking for individuals that have the opportunity to require less funding and services if they have intervention then. So I had a gentleman who had just moved from the state of Pennsylvania, got his eligibility at the age of 22. 6 months later, his family calls me and says APD's contacted them. I'm like shaking my head. Why, you know, he's just gotten on the wait list. He was able to get supported living services and move to one of the independent communities in our state where he could live, pay his rent, etc., live independently, quote unquote, but have support services through the agency that help him be safe. So, you know, again, and they get pilot programs. They're like every other agency. They get things along the way. If you're not in the pot, you're not going to get the opportunity. And the great thing about grants and pilot programs are the people that participate in those are if they decide to make it permanent, are the first ones that get funding. My daughter was able to get through a program called CDC Plus, which I'll talk about at the end because it looks like we might have a couple minutes, because we participated as part of the control group. And that has saved our life for the last 16 years. Crisis. Let's talk about crisis real quick. What is a crisis? Crisis is homelessness, unable to care for self, not unable to care for self because of them, unable to care because their family member is unable to care for them anymore. It used to be age 70 or unable to care. It's no longer that. If you're 90 years old and you have a child at home, you have to prove why you can't care for them at home anymore. It's just the way it is. I had a 90-year-old man whose dementia was setting in and he needed crisis, and they wanted proof that he had some kind of condition that made it impossible for him to take care of his Down syndrome daughter anymore. And then the third one is danger to self or others. That means that there's been DCF or police involvement on a fairly consistent basis, a Baker Act, different things like that. I am going to say this about homelessness. And I'm saying this as a parent, so understand how hard I know this is. I have had parents who really just couldn't have their child home anymore. The stress, the psychological effect was really getting to them. And they wrote a letter saying their child could not live with them anymore because they couldn't care for them anymore. It wasn't helping the child. It wasn't helping them. Homelessness can also be an individual that moves into one of these independent communities in the state. And because they don't have enough skills and support, needs supported living to help them. So what is supported living? Supported living has several aspects to it. It sometimes has a supported living coach. A supported living coach is someone who helps them pay bills, helps them arrange their medical appointments, helps them make a shopping list, etc. Then they have in-home supports. That's someone who helps them cook, clean, get out into the community sometimes, connect in the community they're in. I've had people move to these independent communities and been able to get crisis, because if that didn't happen, the crisis was going to be placement in a group home. So APD has approved it. All right, let's talk about the algorithm real quick. I know we want to get to questions, but I do want to talk about this because some things have changed, and that's the last thing I'm going to talk about. So the algorithm was designed a few years ago It uses a questionnaire that's done every 3 years. The questionnaire is 30 some pages, and that information is used to come up with a number combined with their age of a number that then goes on a sliding scale and determines funding. So over the years, what's happened is, although this is probably the best method they've had in the 35 years my daughter's been involved with these services, it still has huge holes. So what's ended up happening is they come up with funding, and then the waiver support coordinators have to ask for more funding to bridge a gap. I learned recently and got to sit through, they are updating, and I forget the technical name for it, but they have come up with a new document that they're piloting. It is 240 pages long. And the assessment is supposed to take 1 hour. So I sat through it. There are some positives to it, but at least they're trying to do something. You know, there's no perfect way. You cannot take an individual. There's no way to take an individual and come up with a number value that's accurate, because circumstances, individual circumstances are so different. So, you know, it isn't perfect, but I can tell you it's much better than some of the things we had before. The only other thing I'm going to mention real quick is this other page. There are some programs for active military families, because the state of Florida, there is a wait list. So if you're military and you move into the state, you may be here 5 years and never get off the wait list. There are some programs, if they were receiving services in another state, they can contact the agency and apply, and often they can get some services. There's some short-term emergency funding. An individual is being cared for by a parent who has open heart surgery and needs 3-4 months of support. There's some things like that. CDC Plus is a unique program that can be applied for. Instead of having to go through the iBudget, which is what this waiver is called, money is set aside in the individual's name, and their representative, in the case of my daughter, it's me, does a purchasing plan based on that money. And then my daughter becomes an employer. The state handles everything, but she becomes an actual employer, and we are able to hire employees ourselves, and they don't have to come through Medicaid agencies. There's some things they have to do. They have to go through background check. They have to have 1 year experience, but that is very open-ended. But you're able to hire people that you feel comfortable with, or maybe even people that know your child or the child that you're dealing with. All right, so that's kind of in a nutshell. That was fast. I'm sorry, but talking about this agency, we could talk a long time, and the services it does. So now we'll do questions.
If you guys have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat and I'll read them to Claudia. I know she just gave us a lot of information.
A lot of information. Oh, I must have done my job.
I'm not seeing anything yet, Claudia.
That's good.
Claudia, can you talk a little bit about eligibility as far as financial eligibility? Do they have to meet Medicaid requirements?
Okay, so this is the interesting thing with APD. So in the case of APD, there are no financial requirements to become eligible, but they have to go on Medicaid. So let's say somebody isn't on Medicaid, they get eligibility. Now the eligibility they can get without Medicaid, but their name comes up and they're coming off the wait list. That's where this becomes critical. They're coming off the wait list. They don't have Medicaid. And for whatever reason, they have an income coming in that isn't Social Security, isn't SSI or SSDI, particularly SSDI. So they would normally be ineligible for Medicaid, okay? This especially happens with individuals under the age of 18 that become eligible for a special reason. It doesn't happen as often with people over 18, because usually those individuals, if they're seeking APD, have been with an attorney or someone who's educated them in how to handle this. But if for some reason they are income-based ineligible, The income is set aside in the case of APD and Medicaid, but they have to meet the $2,000 asset limit. Okay, so they can't have more than $2,000 in the bank. But if they're still living at home and they're 16 years old, their parents' income does not count if they come up for funding and services. Doesn't count. But the asset limit for the individual, that 16-year-old does do that.
Right.
The other thing, for those of you, if there's anyone on the chat that doesn't understand how Medicaid works, for somebody that is on SSDI, even though this isn't a discussion, it does apply when it comes to APD. If someone is receiving SSDI in an amount over the Medicaid income limit, and they are receiving SSDI on a parent's record, so they are a disabled adult child, that over income does not count for Medicaid. Medicaid only does not look at that because it's a government program. And in 1987, our legislators graciously put within the Palms law, the Social Security law, that those individuals would still be eligible for Medicaid, even if their SSDI on a parent's record as a disabled adult child was more than the Medicaid limit. And that's important to know because every once in a while, a Medicaid person makes a mistake and turns Medicaid off on someone that goes to SSDI. It happened to my own daughter, and I do this for a living, and I was not very happy. And I had to contact Medicaid and educate them to turn her Medicaid back on.
Right, and that's for the disabled adult child benefit. Is what
Correct.
you're saying,
DAC
right?
benefit.
We're
And
on
90
SSI originally under the age of 22, and parent then, either started collecting Social Security, parent died or was disabled, then the child can go on the DAC benefit, disabled
Right.
adult child benefit. It doesn't matter how much that income is. As long as they keep their asset below $2,000, they can get the Medicaid that is necessary for the APD services.
Right. And let me make this comment. A lot of Social Security, because again, there's been a lot of turnover in Social Security during COVID, but it was happening before. When they go to the SSDI under DAC, Social Security will tell them that they don't, the $2,000 limit doesn't apply anymore because it doesn't for SSI because they're not on SSI anymore. It does apply for Medicaid. Once in a while, I was lucky. I had a good person when my husband retired, and they said, you do know that she gets to keep her Medicaid as long as you keep the assets under $2,000. Right. But there are many of these reps that don't understand those idiosyncrasies and they don't say those words. And I have had to salvage a number of people's Medicaid by having them move money, the assets to a trust or to an ABLE account in order to get the Medicaid turned back on. All right, I think we had a question.
We have two questions. I'm going to read the second one because it applies to the conversation you're having, and then I'll go back to the first one.
Okay, thank you.
The second question is, would child support count for income eligibility, or does it receive the same exemption as SSDI?
Okay, so child support for the purpose of Medicaid is tricky. It does count, but there are ways, and you need to talk to an attorney to work this, and you need to do it before the person becomes older and you're dealing with this. There are ways to put the money into a first party trust because it is technically the child's money, okay, and maintain eligibility for Medicaid. So there are ways to do that, but it's very specialized. And I'm seeing more and more child support documents that are very unique. And I don't know a lot about child support, but I've had some recently that I tell people, you need to really, you've got to look at your child support document. You've got to look at your estate planning. You've got to look at Medicaid, and you need an attorney who specializes in all of this and talk with them. I'm really good at spotting it and going, time out, you need to run to the nearest attorney. I have one right now that's getting ready to apply for SSI, and then we'll get Medicaid. And the child support document was written in a way that child support and alimony are together for 3 children and the wife. But as each child comes off, the amount doesn't change. So this is a moving target. Right now, the child's getting equivalent to like $1,300 a month. eventually it's going to be $4,000 a month. This is, and it's a huge problem. So I sent them to a really good attorney. I said, you need to go talk to an attorney before we do this application and get into this. But yes, it does count, but there are ways to shield it and be able to maintain eligibility. What's the other question?
Okay. The first question, so I'll circle back to it, is about CDC Plus. How hard is it to get CDC Plus approved? How long does it take? This person, Eileen, mostly does long-term care planning, and she has many clients who would prefer to have their own aide stay on.
Okay, so I can't tell you how long it takes. One of the first problem we have is if they're already in the APD system and they have a waiver support coordinator, not all waiver support coordinators will do CDC Plus. Okay, there's a lot that will. I have some that will only do CDC Plus. Okay, but there are some that won't. So the first caution I want to give is if a parent asks a waiver support coordinator that's serving them, you know, can we apply for CDC Plus? And they say, no, you don't want to do that, or it takes too long, or there's a wait list. Ask them if they do CDC Plus. I'm sorry, I've had the experience of someone being discouraged from applying for it. If that waiver support coordinator doesn't do it, you find a waiver support coordinator that does, that'll help you apply for it. The amount of time is not real long from my understanding. The last few people I've talked to, it's a process, because once they approve your application to do it, then you have to make the individual an employer, you have to do a purchasing plan, you have to hire your employees, and getting an employee on is both the background check, all of those things, and then doing a new purchasing plan that has to be approved before you can start using the employee. So, you know, I would say it's probably a 4 to 6 month process, depending on the area you're in and how good your waiver support coordinator is in doing this. But the advantage is being able to hire who you want. We have used people in the community that we know. We do word of mouth. I'm actually looking for someone now to add as a backup, and we've been very successful. It gets a little hairy when you lose somebody and you're frantically looking for somebody, but you definitely have more options. You can also pay a family member under CDC Plus. The person who's the representative cannot be paid, but another family member. My son, as a teenager, was taking care of his sister and was able to be paid. We have a extended family member living with us right now who's in college, and he now is an employee for my daughter and taking care of her. He's known her since he was a baby, and he's very good with her. So there's just lots of flexibility with CDC Plus. It's not for everybody, but I don't find it hard once you start doing it. The initial is a little intimidating, but payroll is super easy. It's online. It takes me 3 minutes to do my payroll every week. It's not hard. And they handle all of the checks, the accounting, the tax documents, and everything. Okay.
Great.
Does anybody have any other questions? Because those were the only two I had in the chat. We have, well, it's about time. We could take probably one last minute question if somebody has one, but otherwise it's lunchtime. It's noon.
Raise your hand away.
I'll wrap it up. Why, if we get another question, we can try to answer it, but wanted to thank everybody again for coming. This is the last monthly webinar put on by AGED for the year. We do encourage you, though, however, to provide us with your thoughts on what you would like to see next year, because we do plan on still having the monthly webinars. Again, our focus is on special needs trust, pooled trust, disability benefits. We did a program on ABLE accounts last year. Anything, you know, related to seniors, Medicare, Medicaid, you know, that type of thing with disabilities. We'll try to put on a program for you if you have a particular topic. Again, you will get within a week or so an email from either Julie or Kate at trustaged.org with you know, your certificate of attendance, CEs, etc. for this program. And you can certainly respond to that if you would like to, you know, provide us with any ideas.
Sharon, to ping onto that, I also dropped my email in the chat, so you guys are welcome to email me directly, or as Sharon said, reply to the email with your certificate. We're happy to try to find professionals to speak on the topics you guys are interested in that are in our arena as well.
Okay. Thank you so much again for attending, and everybody I can't believe I'm saying this, but have a great holiday season.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.